10 true scary stories that will leave you speechless. Have you ever stepped into a place where the silence feels alive? A cemetery that isn't just full of graves, but full of hunger? What if you wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time? Stay tuned to discover the chilling truth that no one ever talks about. This story will leave you questioning the very ground beneath your feet. It was just after midnight when Sarah felt it. The cold, unnatural stillness in the air. Her feet crunched softly against the gravel path as she walked through the old, wooded cemetery. The only light came from the moon, casting eerie shadows over the tombstones. She had come here to visit her grandmother's grave. But now, she wasn't so sure why. Something felt wrong. The hairs on her neck stood up. Her breath came in shallow gasps, as though the air itself had thickened. Every step felt heavier than the last. The trees loomed like twisted figures, their branches reaching out like arms. She tried to shake the feeling, telling herself it was just the dark. But it didn't help. Then she heard it. A soft whisper.
Faint.
Barely audible. It seemed to come from behind one of the old mausoleums. Sarah froze, heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes darted toward the sound, but there was nothing. No movement. No shadows. Just the silent graves and the cold, empty night. She told herself it was just the wind. But it wasn't. The whisper came again, louder this time.
It was a name.
Her name. Sarah. She spun around, wide-eyed, searching the cemetery. No one. The graveyard was still.
Too still.
Suddenly, a distant light flickered in the far corner of the cemetery. It wasn't the moon. The light was moving, swaying like a lantern. Someone was walking. But no one should be out here at this hour. Sarah's pulse quickened. Her legs refused to move. She watched the lantern bobbing closer, drawing nearer. And then, through the trees, she saw it. A figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow. But there was something wrong. Its face. Or rather, the lack of one. The figure stopped. And Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine. It didn't speak. It didn't move. It just stared. She wanted to scream, but her throat had closed up. Every instinct told her to run. But her legs betrayed her. The figure took one slow, deliberate step forward. And then another. Closer. Closer. It stopped just feet away. Sarah could feel the cold, the void, emanating from it. And then, it whispered again. This time, it wasn't her name. Join us, it said. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. The words echoed in her mind, a sinister whisper she couldn't escape. Join us, the figure repeated. She felt a pull, something dark wrapping around her mind, like invisible hands tugging at her thoughts.
The figure moved again.
One step forward, then another. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, as though the ground didn't matter. It was too smooth, too fluid. It reached out. Its hands, or what should have been hands, were skeletal, thin, and as dark as the shadows that surrounded it. They hovered just inches from her face. The coldness of its presence burned her skin. Don't, Sarah gasped, her voice barely audible. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it seemed to grow taller, looming over her, blocking out the last slivers of moonlight. Her vision blurred. The cemetery twisted around her. The graves, once familiar, now seemed to shift and writhe like living things. The air grew thick, suffocating. And then, in the middle of the suffocating silence, the figure spoke again. This time, the voice wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. Your time has come. A wave of dizziness hit her, her legs weakening. Her knees buckled, but she couldn't fall. It was as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. Her eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open. The figure loomed closer, its form shifting, distorting, becoming something even darker, something more monstrous. Sarah's mind screamed, but her body was paralyzed. The figure leaned in, its hollow face now just inches from hers. She could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on her. And then she heard it. A faint, distant sound.
A bell? No.
It was a voice. More voices. Whispers.
Hundreds of them.
They were coming from the graves.
From the tombstones.
The earth itself. Help us, one voice pleaded. Don't leave us, another begged. And then she realized. They weren't whispers. They were screams. The souls of the dead, trapped in this cursed place, begging for release. Sarah, the figure said, its voice softer now, but somehow more insistent. Join us, before it's too late. Her heart raced, but her body remained frozen, as though she had no control over it. She was about to lose herself in this nightmare. And then, something changed. A bright light suddenly sliced through the darkness. A beam. It pierced through the trees, illuminating the cemetery in a warm, golden glow. The figure recoiled, shrinking back as if burned. The whispers, the voices, all fell silent. The shadows retreated. Sarah blinked, dazed, disoriented. She could hear footsteps now, fast and heavy. Someone was running toward her. A voice, her brother's, calling her name.
Sarah.
Sarah, where are you? The figure was gone, but the air still felt wrong. As her brother reached her, she collapsed into his arms, shaking uncontrollably. The light faded, the moonlight returning. The cemetery looked normal, silent. But Sarah knew it wasn't. It was never just a cemetery. And whatever that figure was, it wasn't finished with her. Not yet. Sarah clung to her brother, her body trembling uncontrollably. Are you okay? He asked, his voice filled with panic, but there was no comfort in it. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was still trapped in that moment, frozen in time with the figure, the whispers, the suffocating darkness. The cemetery around them was peaceful now, almost too peaceful. But Sarah knew better. The stillness was a lie. As her brother helped her to her feet, she glanced back at the spot where the figure had stood. The ground was undisturbed. No footprints. No sign of movement. It was as if nothing had happened. But she knew it had. Her heart skipped a beat as a sudden thought struck her. What about the lantern? She whispered, barely audible. Her brother turned, confused. The lantern. There was a light, she said, her voice shaking. It was moving. Her brother looked around, his gaze darting to the path that led out of the cemetery. There's nothing here, he said, a hint of skepticism in his tone. Sarah's eyes narrowed. That light had been real. She had seen it. It had drawn the figure to her. It had led it straight to her. She took a step forward, her feet feeling heavier now, as though something was holding her back. Something invisible. Her brother tugged at her arm, pulling her toward the exit. We need to get out of here, he said urgently. But Sarah couldn't move. Not yet. The sense of unease clung to her like a shadow, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. And then she heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound. A scratching noise. It came from behind one of the mausoleums, faint but distinct. She froze. Her brother didn't seem to hear it. Sarah, please. Let's go, he said, his voice sharp now. But Sarah couldn't tear her gaze away from the source of the noise. It was getting louder. Scratching. Then a soft thud. Like something or someone was trying to get out. Her heart raced. Her mind screamed for her to run, to get away from this place, from whatever was lurking in the darkness. But her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence. A deep, suffocating silence. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. The cemetery was never empty. Not anymore. It had been waiting for her. And she could feel it. It was still there. Still watching. Still waiting. Sarah, her brother said, more forcefully this time. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. Let's go. But Sarah barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on the mausoleum. A figure stood there. Not the same as before. No cloak. No face. But it was still the same. It was watching her. And then it spoke. Come back. Her blood ran cold. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Sarah's brother, finally noticing her panic, turned to look. But when he did, the figure was gone. The graveyard had swallowed it whole, like it always did. But not before it whispered its final warning. Come back. The air grew cold again. And deep in the distance, Sarah thought she heard the faintest sound of a bell ringing. A death knell. A reminder that no one ever really leaves this place. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the empty space where the figure had been. Her brother was still gripping her shoulders, his hands tight, desperate. Sarah, what's going on? You're scaring me, he pleaded, his voice rising in panic. She couldn't look away from the spot. She couldn't move. The whispers had started again. Not from the figure, but from all around her. From the very ground beneath her feet.
Soft. Low.
Unclear.
But there.
Always there. Sarah, we need to leave, her brother urged, shaking her more forcefully now. She finally tore her eyes from the mausoleum, looking up at him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. But he couldn't see what she saw. He couldn't hear the voices. It was her burden, not his. I heard it again, Sarah whispered, barely audible. The bell, the voices. She gasped for air, trying to steady herself. Her brother's confusion deepened. What bell? What voices, Sarah? You're not making sense. Her legs felt weak, as though the earth was slowly pulling her down. She stumbled backward. But then she stopped. A sudden realization hit her with a violent force. The whispers. They were familiar. They were voices she had heard before. Long ago. Her grandmother's voice, calling her as a child. Her mother's, soothing and gentle. Her father's, low and calm. And the others. People she hadn't thought about in years. The cemetery wasn't just filled with spirits of the dead. It was filled with memories. Sarah, her brother shouted, snapping her from her trance. She turned to him, wide-eyed. He wasn't facing the mausoleum. He didn't see it, but she did. The figure was back. It stood just behind him, lurking in the shadows. And this time, its shape was clearer. It wasn't tall or cloaked. It was small, fragile, a child's figure, the same size as Sarah when she was young. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers. And as it took a step forward, Sarah's blood ran cold. It was wearing her childhood clothes. The same dress she used to wear on sunny afternoons. The same shoes. Her shoes. Her heart stopped. The whispers grew louder now. Come back, it's your time now. She couldn't breathe. Her brother's voice cut through the noise. Sarah, what is it? Tell me. But Sarah couldn't answer. Her body was no longer her own. The figure's gaze never wavered. Its lips parted, and from its mouth a voice came. Not a whisper. A command. Come home, The cemetery around them began to blur, the tombstones twisting into grotesque shapes. The air thickened with something far darker than before. The light from the moon flickered. And as Sarah felt her legs give way beneath her, the figure in front of her stepped closer. Closer. And Sarah realized with a horrifying certainty what it wanted. It didn't want her to leave. It never had. It wanted her to stay. Forever, the figure reached out, its small, fragile hands hovering just inches from Sarah's face. Her body was no longer hers to control. She felt like she was sinking into the earth, the weight of the cemetery pulling her down into the dirt. Her brother shook her again, panic-stricken. Sarah, you're not okay. What's happening to you? But Sarah couldn't respond. The whispers were deafening now. A chorus of voices, all familiar, all urgent. Come back, Her eyes darted toward the figure, once more. It was right there. So close she could almost reach out and touch it. And then, as if to show her what it wanted, the figure lifted its arms and pulled back its hood. For a second, Sarah thought she was going to faint. The face wasn't a child's face anymore. It was her own. A distorted, hollow version of her face, pale and empty, eyes wide with terror. A version of herself from a time long past. Her own reflection, but wrong.
So wrong.
The figure's lips moved, and the words came again. Come home, But now it wasn't a command. It was a promise. A promise that felt like a heavy weight, pulling her deeper into the darkness. The air became thick with cold, suffocating her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She was drowning in the voices, in the memories. Her brother pulled her back again, this time with more force. "No," he shouted, his grip tightening around her. "Sarah, we're leaving. You have to snap out of it." But it wasn't her brother's voice that she heard anymore. It was the figures. The distorted face smiled, and Sarah felt it in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't her anymore. It wasn't even her brother. The cemetery was alive now. Alive with something ancient. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, revealing a chasm of darkness. The whispers grew louder, blending with a low, guttural growl. Her brother screamed in terror, backing away, but the ground seemed to be pulling him down. "Sarah, please." But she couldn't help him. She couldn't move. The figure reached for her again, and Sarah felt the cold fingers brush her cheek. The last thing she heard was her brother's cry. A desperate plea. But the cemetery had already claimed him. And she was already gone. The figure whispered once more. Welcome home, asterisk. Then, the darkness swallowed her whole. The darkness was absolute. No light. No sound. Just an endless, suffocating void that pressed in from all sides. Sarah couldn't feel her body anymore. She was weightless, adrift in the emptiness, surrounded by nothing. And yet, somehow, she knew the cemetery hadn't let go of her. It had merely shifted its grip. The voices were still there. Faint at first, like whispers in the wind, but then they grew clearer. Hundreds of voices, all speaking at once, all calling to her, urging her. Come home. Come back to us. The figure's face, her own distorted face, flashed before her eyes. But this time, it wasn't just her face. It was the faces of everyone she'd ever known. Her parents, her friends, her family, all of them. And they were all here, in this darkness, in this place. Sarah, her grandmother's voice, soft and comforting, cut through the cacophony. "Sarah, it's time." Her heart slammed against her chest. She knew this place now. She knew what this was. It wasn't just a cemetery. It was a prison, a trap, a place where the dead never truly left. And those who were brought here never escaped. Not fully. She felt the ground beneath her shift again, like something was moving beneath her feet. The floor of the void cracked open, and she felt herself falling. Falling deeper. Deeper into the darkness. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Then, as suddenly as the fall had started, she landed. It wasn't soft. It wasn't painful. It was just cold. When her eyes opened, she was no longer weightless. She was standing, but not in the cemetery. Not in the world she knew. She was surrounded by rows upon rows of graves. But these were different. The tombstones weren't carved with names. They were blank, empty. The air smelled stale, musty. The silence was unbearable, thick with a presence that made her skin crawl. Sarah turned around, disoriented. Behind her, she saw a figure emerge from the darkness. It was tall, cloaked in shadow. The same figure from the cemetery. But this time, its face wasn't hollow. It was hers. The same distorted, twisted reflection of her own face. Welcome home, Sarah, The figure's voice was low and raspy, but there was something else behind it now. A sickening warmth, as if it was waiting for her to join it. Her legs felt weak again, but this time, she forced herself to move. She didn't want to be here. Not in this place. Not with this thing. But the more she tried to walk away, the more the ground beneath her feet seemed to pull her back. Her breath caught in her throat. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer. And as it did, the ground began to tremble. The graves shifted, their stone faces turning toward her. Then, the whispers started again. But this time, they weren't just voices. They were screams. The screams of the lost souls who had been here before her. The ones who had never escaped. Join us, Sarah, asterisk. The figure's hand reached out toward her, its fingers long and twisted. And Sarah knew, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, that she wasn't just a prisoner. She was now part of this place. Part of the darkness. She had always been. She had always belonged. As the figure's fingers brushed against her skin, a cold rush of memories surged through her mind. Memories of things she had long forgotten. Of promises made long ago. And she realized, too late, that the cemetery wasn't just calling her. It was claiming her. Asterisk, come back. Sarah, asterisk, the voice came again, not from the figure, but from all around her. And this time, she didn't resist. This time, she stepped forward. Into the darkness. The whispers faded. The light flickered. And Sarah was gone. Forever, the silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence. Heavy. Oppressive. The world seemed to hold its breath. In the empty void, Sarah stood, but not as she once had. She was no longer herself, at least not in the way she had been. Her body felt like a vessel, hollow and cold, filled with the souls of those who had come before her. The graves around her began to shift, and the tombstones, once blank, now bore names. Her name, her grandmother's, her father's, names of the lost, names of the forgotten. The ground beneath her trembled again, and Sarah realized, too late, that she wasn't standing on the earth anymore. She was below it, below the living world, a part of the cemetery, a part of the trap. And all those voices, those souls, they were hers now. Every one of them. She could feel them, pressing against her mind, tugging at her thoughts. Asterisk, join us, asterisk, they whispered again. But this time, it wasn't the figure speaking. It was her speaking. It was Sarah calling out, reaching for her brother, her parents, anyone who could hear her. But there was no one left. Not anymore. The figure, the shadow that had once called to her, now stood behind her. It was taller now, impossibly tall, its face still twisted into that hollow, grotesque reflection of her own. It reached out again. But this time, it didn't touch her. Instead, it merged with her. Like a dark force, it absorbed her, pulling her into itself. Her body stiffened, her senses flooded with a terrible awareness. And in that moment, Sarah understood. She wasn't just a part of the cemetery. She was becoming it. A new shadow, a new whisper, a new voice in the dark. Her soul, along with all the others, was bound to this place. Bound to the tombstones, to the earth, to the endless, suffocating silence. And then, as if in response to an ancient call, the cemetery stirred again. Graves cracked open. Tombstones shifted. New names appeared. And Sarah, no longer able to remember who she had once been, felt the pull of the endless void. She couldn't escape.
Not now.
Not ever. Asterisk, come back, asterisk, she heard it again. Not a whisper. Not a command. But a promise. And she knew, deep in her core, that the cemetery was never finished. Not with her. Not with anyone. It was waiting. Always waiting. For the next lost soul. For the next one to wander in. And, just like Sarah, they would never leave. Not fully. The darkness swallowed her again. And the cemetery grew silent once more. The silence stretched on. Endless. Deafening. But Sarah was no longer afraid of it. She had become part of it. The ground beneath her seemed to pulse now, as though it was alive, breathing with an ancient rhythm. She felt a cold wind sweep through the graveyard, though there was no wind. It was the cemetery's breath. The tombstones around her stood like silent sentinels, their faces now etched with hundreds of names, all of them familiar. Her name was still there, but it no longer felt like hers. It felt like a distant echo, like the remnants of someone who had been long forgotten. And as she stood there, lost in the inescapable darkness, something shifted in the air. The stillness began to fracture. Cracks spread across the ground, lines of light seeping through, like the first signs of dawn. But it wasn't dawn. It was the arrival of something worse. Something far darker. From the depths of the earth, something stirred. The cemetery wasn't just a prison. It was a living thing, feeding on the souls trapped within it, waiting for the right moment to grow. And now it was time. Sarah could feel it. The earth trembled again, but this time it wasn't just beneath her feet. The air itself was shaking. The cemetery's grip tightened around her, a vice that pulled her deeper, deeper into the cold. And then a sound. A low, growling hum. Not from the earth, not from the wind, but from the very air around her. It was the sound of something waking up. Something hungry. Her heart, no, what was left of it, pounded in her chest as a shadow rose from the ground. A figure.
Tall.
Looming. Darker than the night. It was the same figure she had seen before. But now it was different. Its face, her face, twisted with an unnatural smile. The eyes were wide, unblinking, hollow. It reached out toward her again, its hands long and bony, but this time, they weren't reaching for her alone. They were reaching for everyone. For every soul trapped here, every lost wanderer. For the newcomers who would soon arrive. The ones who would walk the cemetery's paths unknowingly, just like she had. And Sarah realized, too late, that the figure was not just her. It was the cemetery itself. It was the embodiment of everything it had consumed over the years. All the lost souls. All the forgotten ones. All the people who had been pulled in one by one until they became part of its endless hunger. The figure's smile stretched impossibly wide, its voice a harsh whisper in the air. Welcome back, And as Sarah stood there, feeling her body dissolve into the darkness, she understood what she had become. She was no longer just Sarah. She was the cemetery. She was one of them. And she would wait.
Just like they had.
For the next lost soul. For the next wanderer. For the next person who would never leave. The ground trembled again. And then, the cemetery went quiet once more. But it wasn't empty. It was never empty. The quiet stretched on, suffocating and thick, like a blanket that weighed down on every corner of the cemetery. But Sarah was no longer alone in the silence. The air was alive, vibrating with something ancient, something that had always been there, hidden in the shadows of the tombstones, waiting. The whispers were still there, but now they were hers too. She could feel them. She could hear them, rising in chorus, a low hum of voices, her own voice among them. The other souls. The ones who had come before. All of them, tangled together, forever bound in the cemetery's embrace. And as Sarah, or what was left of her, stood among the tombstones, the ground shifted once again. The cracks in the earth widened, and from the depths, something stirred. Something far older. A shape rose slowly from the ground, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. It was like a shadow at first, impossible to describe, with no true form. But as it grew, it took shape. A figure, a towering figure. Its face was as black as the night itself, void of features, save for a single, burning light in its center, a single, glaring eye. It was watching Sarah. No, not just her. It was watching the cemetery, watching all of them, all the souls bound here, waiting. The earth trembled beneath her feet, but this time, the tremor felt different. It wasn't the ground shifting. It was the cemetery itself breathing.
Alive.
The shadow figure stretched out a hand, and the air around Sarah seemed to grow even colder.
There was no escape.
There was no way back. Welcome home, it whispered. The voice wasn't its own. It was all of their voices, all the lost souls speaking in unison. A collective chorus. A terrible lullaby. Sarah could feel herself being pulled again, like a magnet drawing her in. She wasn't sure if it was the figure or the cemetery itself, but something was pulling at her, calling her. She could see the cracks spreading across the earth, the ground breaking open, revealing deeper shadows beneath. And then, the earth began to open wider, not just beneath her feet, but all around her. The tombstones started to crack, their stone faces crumbling and revealing hollow, gaping mouths beneath. The cemetery wasn't just a place. It was a mouth, a hungry, insatiable mouth that devoured the living, the dead, and anyone who wandered too close. And as the cracks deepened, Sarah realized what she had truly become. Not a soul lost to time, not a spirit in a grave, but a part of something far darker. A new whisper in the wind, a new waiter, waiting for the next soul to wander into the cemetery's path. And there was no escape. Not for her. Not for anyone. The cemetery was alive. And it was always hungry. Always watching. And it would never stop. Sarah felt her presence slip away once more. Her body was no longer hers, but the figures, the cemetery's. A part of the ever-growing dark. And the cycle would begin again. Somewhere, deep in the earth, a soft sound broke the silence.
A bell.
Distant.
Faint.
But it was calling. Calling for the next one. And as the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, the whispers began again. A voice. Another name. The next lost soul. And the cemetery waited. As it always did, the bell's sound was faint at first, barely audible, like the distant tolling of a forgotten chime. But as the seconds stretched on, the bell grew louder, clearer, almost impossible to ignore. It rang with a haunting, rhythmic precision, as though it had been tolling for centuries, calling to those who had lost their way, calling to the living, calling to the next soul. And as the light of dawn crept across the horizon, the cemetery seemed to shift again. Not in the way it had before. This time, the entire ground seemed to stir, as if waking from an eternal slumber. The tombstones, the mausoleums, the graves, they all shifted. They moved ever so slightly, as if the earth itself was flexing and groaning under some unseen force. The wind picked up, but it wasn't a natural breeze. It was the cold breath of the cemetery. The air shifted. It was heavier,
Thicker.
the very ground beneath Sarah, or what is left of her, seemed to hum with energy. The earth had been waiting, and now it was time. The bell continued to toll, echoing through the graveyard. A single figure stood at the edge of the cemetery, barely visible against the growing light of morning. It was a man, tall and hunched, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He had wandered too close. He was a stranger. Sarah, or whatever she had become, could sense him before he even noticed the cemetery. The air around her pulsed, the darkness beckoning, as if drawing him in. He moved forward, cautiously at first, unaware of the danger that awaited him. But with each step, the bell's toll became louder, more insistent. The shadows stretched and shifted. The cemetery felt him, and it knew what he was. He was the one. The next lost soul. The one who would fill the vacancy, take the place, and continue the cycle. Sarah felt the cold pull of the cemetery's hunger. It was undeniable. It was part of her now. The man's footsteps echoed through the graveyard. The wind whispered in his ear, but he didn't listen. He didn't notice the stones shifting beneath his feet. He didn't feel the weight of the cemetery pressing down on him. Until it was too late. His foot landed on a grave. And the earth shifted. A deep, rumbling sound, like the world itself was yawning. The ground cracked open, and the tombstones rose around him like jagged teeth, blocking his escape. The man froze, eyes wide with terror as the cold wind began to howl. But it was already too late. The ground trembled again, and from beneath the earth, something reached up. A hand.
Pale.
Long twisted. It wrapped around the man's ankle with a sickening snap. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the earth. A second hand reached out, and then a third. They were everywhere. Shadows rising from beneath the soil, the long-forgotten dead, and the souls that had been swallowed before him. The cemetery's hunger was insatiable. The man's cries for mercy were quickly silenced as the earth claimed him. His body disappeared into the ground, pulled beneath the surface with terrifying speed. The bell tolled one last time. And then there was silence. The cemetery stood still. Empty for now. But it would never truly be empty. Not again. Not while it still waited. The ground, though still and quiet, had already begun to stir once more, to beckon the next unwitting soul into its grasp. And as Sarah stood there, Or, as what was left of her stood among the graves, she could feel it. The pulse of the earth. The rhythm of the cemetery. The cycle would continue. The hunger would never stop. And the bell would toll again. For the next one. The next lost soul. And the cycle would repeat. Forever, the stillness that followed was deceptive. For beneath the surface, the cemetery was far from quiet. It waited. And it always knew when the next soul would wander too close. The ground hummed with an unnatural energy, a faint tremor running through it, as though the cemetery could feel the breath of the living world beyond its borders. And somewhere, far off, beyond the dark edges of the cemetery, a car engine sputtered. A voice shouted. A laugh, light and carefree, echoed through the trees. The cemetery knew. The bell rang once more, a single, reverberating chime that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was softer than before, a mere whisper on the wind, but it had the same weight, the same call. The figure, the one who had been Sarah, felt it. The hunger, the call. But now, she wasn't Sarah. Not entirely. She was the cemetery. She was part of it. And she knew, as she felt the pulse of the earth beneath her, that it was time. The next soul was almost here. She could sense it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Two figures emerged from the trees, talking, laughing, unaware of the dark presence watching them from the cemetery's borders. A man and a woman, young and full of life, their voices light with the thrill of their spontaneous adventure. The man paused, glancing at the entrance to the cemetery, where the gates hung loosely, swaying in the wind. "Hey," he said, nodding toward the entrance. "Have you ever been in there?" The woman, a slight tremor of excitement in her voice, shook her head. "I've heard the stories. Creepy old cemetery, supposedly haunted." The man grinned, the thrill of the unknown in his eyes. "Perfect. Let's see if the stories are true." And with that, they crossed the threshold, stepping into the cemetery's shadow. They didn't notice how the air grew cold, how the sky seemed to dim, despite the morning light still hanging faintly on the horizon. They didn't notice the ground beneath their feet shifting, groaning like it had been disturbed after centuries of stillness. But Sarah, or what had become of her, felt it. She felt the pulse of the earth quicken, the hunger rising again. The bell tolled once more. And now it was her turn. She could feel the figure, the cemetery, urging her to act, to join the others.
To claim.
She rose, slowly at first, her form shadowed and indistinct, a mere silhouette among the gravestones. The man and woman walked deeper into the cemetery, their voices fading as they moved toward the center, toward the heart of the place. But it wasn't the graves that would claim them. It was the cemetery itself. It wasn't just stone. It wasn't just earth. It was alive. And it was waiting. The man turned toward the mausoleum, his curiosity piqued. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice suddenly quieter, unsure. The woman frowned, peering into the shadows.
"What?"
"No, I don't hear anything." She stepped forward, but the ground beneath her feet shifted again, as though it were drawing her in, pulling her closer. Before she could react, the tombstones shifted, closing in on her path, blocking her way. She turned back toward the man, panic now creeping into her voice. "We need to leave. This place isn't right." But he didn't hear her. His eyes were locked on something in the distance.
Sarah.
Her form flickered for a moment, a shadow among the gravestones. She moved closer, stepping from one dark corner to another, unnoticed by the young couple. And then, as the woman reached for him, as the tension in the air grew thick, the ground beneath them cracked open. A hand, pale, skeletal, shot up from the soil, wrapping around the woman's ankle with a sudden, unrelenting force. She screamed, stumbling back, but more hands followed, twisting, reaching from the earth, pulling her down. The man rushed forward, shouting her name, trying to pull her free, but the ground was opening wide, swallowing them both. The woman's screams were cut short as she was dragged into the earth, her body vanishing beneath the surface. And then the man was alone. He stood, frozen, staring at the spot where she had disappeared, unable to move, unable to breathe. The cemetery had claimed her, and now it wanted him. From the darkness, the figure, Sarah, the embodiment of the cemetery, stepped forward. She was no longer just the silent watcher. She was the force, the hunger. The man looked up at her, eyes wide with terror. You, what is this? He gasped, his voice breaking. Welcome home. Sarah's voice was a rasping whisper, but it carried with a depth of darkness that shook him to his core. He took a step back, trembling, realizing too late the terrible truth. He was never leaving. The cemetery's pull grew stronger. He could feel it, dragging at his limbs, his body becoming heavy with each passing second. The figure's hollow eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he saw the thousands of faces behind her, spirits, lost souls, all waiting in the shadows. He tried to run, but the earth seemed to pull him down with each step. The gravestones around him began to close in, their jagged forms blocking his path. The bell tolled again, and the earth cracked open wider. It was too late. He was already part of it. And as the ground swallowed him whole, the cemetery once more fell silent. The cycle would begin again, and the bell would toll. The silence that followed was profound. The bell had stopped tolling, but the air was still thick with the weight of what had just happened. The cemetery had claimed its prize. And now, the earth settled back into its dark, oppressive stillness. The graves stood silent, their jagged edges softened by the weight of time, as if they had already swallowed the next soul whole. The shadows stretched long and far, reaching across the forgotten paths. But the cemetery wasn't empty. It was never empty. In the distance, where the trees met the far edge of the cemetery, a faint rustle disturbed the air. A car engine, then voices. Two more figures, oblivious to the horrors they were about to walk into, approached the gates. A man and a woman. The woman's voice was light, laughing, as she glanced over at the dark entrance to the cemetery. I heard about this place. Some people say it's haunted. The man, his face hidden behind sunglasses, smirked. What's the fun of visiting if it isn't haunted?
They were closer now.
Closer to the gate. And the cemetery knew. Sarah, or what had become of her, felt the shift in the air. Another pair of wanderers. Another pair of lost souls to join the never-ending cycle. She stood in the shadows, her form flickering like a mirage, watching them. The hunger that gripped the earth was constant, insatiable, waiting for the next one. The woman took the lead, moving toward the opening gate, her curiosity piqued. Let's see how haunted this place really is, she said with a grin. The man followed, laughing under his breath. I'm all in if it means scaring you a little. They crossed the threshold. The bell tolled once more. The sound was sharp and deep, echoing through the graveyard like a warning. But they didn't hear it. They didn't notice the change in the air, the way the temperature dropped, the way the shadows seemed to lean toward them, hungry and expectant. The cemetery had come alive, and they were its next victims. The woman paused as she looked around, a frown crossing her face. It's too quiet, don't you think? But the man was already stepping deeper into the cemetery, oblivious to the subtle tremor in the earth. It's just a cemetery, babe. What's the worst that could happen? He laughed, but the sound didn't carry far. The woman stood still for a moment longer, her instincts pricking at her. She could feel something wrong in the air, like the way you feel when someone is watching you from a distance. Her gaze flicked to the shadows, but she saw nothing, except the figure. A flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the tombstones. Her heart pounded harder. Did you see that? She whispered, her voice trembling. The man turned, his expression dismissive. It's probably just a raccoon or something. Let's go. But the ground shifted beneath them, pulling them in. Slowly at first, like the subtle grip of a hand tightening around their ankles, making it harder to move. The woman stepped back, suddenly aware that the cemetery wasn't just a collection of old graves. It was something alive, and it was aware of them. The trees around them shifted. The tombstones groaned. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, cloaked in darkness. Her breath hitched in her throat. A shadow of someone, but it wasn't quite human. Not anymore. Her feet were rooted to the ground. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. The cemetery had claimed her. It pulled her deeper. The figure stepped forward and she realized, just like the others before her, that it wasn't a person at all. It was the embodiment of the cemetery itself. A long-forgotten soul, bound to the earth, now walking in the bodies of those who came too close. It reached out, long fingers stretching toward her, pulling her in, feeding her fear. She gasped for air, but the earth had already opened beneath her, the ground alive, dragging her toward its gaping maw. She tried to fight, tried to scream, but it was like she was drowning, her body sinking slowly, the earth swallowing her whole. The man, who had been laughing only moments ago, turned in confusion. "Where did you?" But before he could finish, the ground beneath his feet gave way. A hand, pale and skeletal, shot up from the earth, grabbing him by the ankle, yanking him down with a force that shattered his scream. More hands followed, ghastly hands, writhing from the soil, pulling, clawing, dragging him under. The woman's voice, the last thing he heard, was barely a whisper as her body disappeared from sight, consumed by the ground. The bell tolled again, a single chime that rang through the empty graveyard. And the cemetery went quiet once more. The figures were gone, but the earth had not forgotten. It never did. The hunger was still there, always there. And the cycle would begin again, with the next lost soul, the next wanderer. And the cemetery would continue waiting. Forever, the stillness returned to the cemetery, a suffocating, eternal silence that hung in the air like thick fog. The moon hung high now, casting long, ghostly shadows across the cracked tombstones, the silhouettes of the dead stretching in every direction. The bell had stopped, but the cemetery still waited, alive in its own way, its breath slow, steady, and ever hungry. But then, something shifted again. Far off, past the trees, the distant hum of a car engine buzzed through the night. It was faint at first, a tiny sound, barely noticeable against the silence. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, and the headlights of a car pierced the darkness. It was coming. Another soul, unknowingly drawn to the very place that would become their tomb. The car pulled up at the entrance of the cemetery, its tires crunching over the gravel. The headlights briefly illuminated the wrought iron gates that stood open like waiting arms. Inside the car were two figures, a man and a woman. They were different from the others. They weren't wandering, lost in their own curiosity. They had a purpose. The man, tall with shaggy brown hair, leaned over to the woman, a half-smile playing on his lips. "You sure about this? You said you wanted to see something real." The woman, younger than the man by several years, nodded with a determined look in her eyes. "I told you. No more ghost stories. No more rumors. I want to know if it's true." She pushed the door open, stepping out into the cool night air. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled her lungs. Her pulse quickened, but she stood tall, masking the nervousness beneath her bravado. The man followed her, the door slamming shut behind him with an eerie finality. "Let's make this quick, okay?" He adjusted his jacket, his eyes scanning the cemetery gates warily. "Right behind you," he said, trying to mask the uncertainty in his voice. They walked toward the gate, stepping into the shadow of the tombstones. The cemetery had not noticed them yet. Not immediately. It waited. But it always knew when something had crossed into its grasp. They moved deeper into the graveyard, their footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of fallen leaves. The woman glanced around, her breath visible in the cold night air. "This place feels wrong," she whispered. The man chuckled nervously, though there was no humor in his voice. "It's just a cemetery. Probably haunted, but nothing to worry about." But the woman wasn't convinced. She had done her research, read the stories of the missing, the ones who had entered this place and never returned. The warnings were clear. Don't go near the cemetery after dark. And yet, here they were, their feet carrying them forward despite the unease that gnawed at their insides. Suddenly, the wind picked up. A low, mournful howl carried through the trees, rattling the branches. The woman stopped, her body rigid, eyes darting to the shadows. She felt it then, the cold pressure of something watching them. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was close. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man, now visibly uneasy, nodded. "Yeah, let's just finish this. We're not here for the drama." But even as he said it, something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped sharply. A soft, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The wind picked up again, swirling around them with unnatural speed. The trees groaned as though they were bending under a heavy weight. And then the ground shifted. The woman gasped, looking down as the earth beneath her feet seemed to tremble. The sound of cracking filled the air, as if the earth was opening, splitting in slow, deliberate motion. The tombstones, they were moving. Her blood ran cold as she looked to her side, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a figure. Not a person. Not even a shadow. It was something other. A twisted, malformed shape that flickered in and out of sight, its features an unsettling mixture of shadow and form, like a nightmare half-remembered. It was watching them, and there was a deep, insidious hunger in its eyes. The woman's breath caught in her throat. "What the hell is that?" The man's eyes widened in fear. "Get back to the car.
Now."
But before they could move, the ground split open with a deafening crack. A hand, pale, cold, and twisted, shot up from the soil, grabbing the man by the ankle with an inhuman strength. He screamed, struggling to free himself, but more hands emerged from the earth, wrapping around his legs, his arms. The earth was alive, pulling him down into its depths.
"No."
"Help," he screamed, but the woman could only watch in horror as his body was dragged into the ground, his screams swallowed by the earth. His body was gone, consumed. The woman froze, terror gripping her heart. And then, as the air turned colder, the figure, Sarah stepped forward from the shadows, her form flickering like a dying flame. The woman tried to back away, but her feet were rooted to the ground, as though the earth itself was holding her in place. "Please no," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the howling wind. "What are you?" The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes gleaming with an empty malice. "I am the cemetery. And you are mine now." The ground trembled beneath her, but it wasn't from the wind or the movement of the earth. It was the hunger, the call of the cemetery, growing stronger, reaching for her. Her body was no longer her own. The earth called her. It pulled her in. She struggled, but it was futile. She could feel herself slipping, falling, into the cold, suffocating darkness. She reached out, screaming, but no sound escaped her lips. Her vision blurred as she was dragged under, consumed by the ground. And then, silence. Once again, the cemetery stood still, waiting. The graveyard's breath slowed, and the moon's light dimmed. The cycle was complete, and the bell tolled once more. For the next lost soul, for the next wanderer, and the cemetery would wait. Forever, the silence that enveloped the cemetery was a living thing. It stretched long and thick, suffocating everything in its path. The shadows between the gravestones deepened as the moon rose higher, casting its cold, silver glow over the barren earth. The bell had tolled, once again, but its sound had faded into the night, absorbed by the very soil itself. Yet something stirred beneath the surface. It was barely perceptible, like a shiver under the skin of the earth. A tremor that ran through the ground and deep into the bones of the cemetery. And as the wind whispered between the tombstones, carrying with it the weight of centuries of forgotten souls, the cemetery waited. It always waited. Far away, in the distance, a flicker of movement appeared. The headlights of a car bounced over the narrow road leading toward the cemetery gates. It was a lone figure, an old man, his frail hands gripping the wheel, his face carved with the years of a lifetime that had seen too much. His car came to a halt just beyond the gates, and for a moment, he sat still, looking at the cemetery in front of him, as if unsure whether to go forward. His eyes were tired, dark rings of exhaustion beneath them. But there was something else, a pull, an unshakable feeling that he had been here before, many years ago. Or maybe it was something older, something deeper. He stepped out of the car, his joints creaking with the effort. His footsteps, though slow, were determined, echoing through the stillness. As he moved closer to the gates, the ground seemed to groan beneath him, but he paid it no mind. He had seen enough to know that something in the world was beyond understanding, beyond explanation. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He reached the gates. The wind picked up, but it didn't deter him. With a single motion, he pushed the creaking gates open. And then, for the first time in many years, the cemetery sensed him. The earth shuddered. The tombstones seemed to lean forward, as if straining to catch a glimpse of the new arrival. The air became thick with a low hum, the whispers of souls that had long since passed, all beckoning him, calling him to join them. The man paused at the entrance, his breath catching in his throat. He had been here before, yes, but now it was different. This time, the cemetery was no longer waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for him. The ground shifted beneath his feet, as if welcoming him home. And as the old man stepped forward, his footsteps sinking slightly into the earth, the shadows around him deepened. And then, from the darkness, the figure emerged, tall, shadowed, with eyes that glowed faintly like dying embers. The man stared into the void of those eyes, a chill creeping up his spine. It's time, the figure whispered, its voice the wind, the rustling leaves, the echo of countless lost souls. The man's heart raced, but his expression remained calm, resolute. He had known, all along, that the cemetery was a living thing, that it could not be escaped. It had claimed him long ago, and now, after so many years, it was time for him to finally be the cemetery. The figure raised its hand, and the earth cracked wide open, like the maw of some great beast. The ground swallowed him whole, and his body vanished into the dark, empty soil. The bell tolled once more, and the cycle, ancient and endless, began again. For the next lost soul, for the next wanderer, for the cemetery. Forever, the wind had died down. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long, ghostly shadows across the graveyard. The tombstones, cracked and weathered by time, stood like silent sentinels, bearing witness to countless lost souls. The cemetery had swallowed its last, as it always did, and now it waited. The ground was still, unnaturally so, as if the earth itself had settled into a deep, uneasy slumber. The trees no longer swayed in the breeze, and the distant sounds of the world outside had faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the night. Yet beneath the surface, the pulse was there. The hunger was always there. And in that stillness, something was shifting. Something was stirring from deep within the soil. The cemetery had claimed another. But now, for the first time in a long while, it paused. It did not move. It did not call out. It did not beckon. It waited. Far from the cemetery's borders, a new light flickered in the distance, a single car's headlights cutting through the darkness. But this time, the cemetery did not hunger for what approached. It simply observed, as it always had, from its quiet, eternal slumber. The car came to a stop at the edge of the graveyard. The driver, a young man, weary from the long road, stepped out. His boots crunched over the gravel as he made his way toward the gates, his face tired but peaceful, as if he had seen the world and was ready to rest. He had heard the stories, of course, the whispers of those who had come before him, lost in the depths of the cemetery, their bodies swallowed by the earth and their souls claimed by the hunger. But there was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation. He reached for the gate, pushing it open with a soft creak. The night air was cool against his skin, but it wasn't the chilling kind of cold. It felt, for the first time in ages, like something more natural. He took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold. Nothing happened. No tremor in the earth, no cold chill. The cemetery did not stir. The bell did not toll. It simply watched. He walked deeper into the graveyard, his steps slow but confident. The path was familiar. It felt like home. As he approached the center, the grave markers faded into the background, their jagged shapes softened by time and neglect. There was something peaceful here, something undisturbed. He sat on the ground, between two old graves, and closed his eyes. The world outside, the noise, the rush, the endless searching, faded away. For the first time in years, he was at peace. And the cemetery, for once, allowed him that peace. It watched over him in silence, its hunger momentarily sated. The bell did not toll. The wind did not stir. The earth was still. And in that stillness, the cemetery rested. But it would never forget. The cycle would begin again someday. Because that was how the cemetery lived. That was how it waited. Forever.